Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. In today's program, we will continue our discussion about the fascinating life of C.S. Lewis and the incredible influence that he had over the course of his life. And that impact continues even today through his many writings over many different genres. In last week's episode, we discussed the early days of Lewis's life leading up to his conversion as an adult in his early 30s. But today we will discuss his life and impact as a Christian writer, radio host, theologian, and apologist. And to have this conversation, I'm pleased to have one of my colleagues, Dr. Timothy Yoder, back in the podcast studio. Dr. Yoder is an associate professor of theological studies here at DTS. He has been teaching in the area of theology, apologetics, ethics, and logic for over 30 years. He has also taught courses on the philosophy of C.S. Lewis. Prior to teaching here at DTS, Dr. Yoder taught at Marquette University and Cairn University. Dr. Yoder, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Well, thank you for having me again. It's a real joy to do this. I love talking about Lewis and his writings, his creativity, and his apologetics.
Well, in last week's podcast, Dr. Yoder helped us to better understand the events in Lewis's life that really shaped him for the good and for the bad. We learned about Lewis's journey from Christian to atheist, and then from atheist to theist, and finally from theist to Christian again. If you missed last week's program, you will want to go back and listen to it first, and then return to join us for this episode, as this episode will build on the last one. But by way of review, Dr. Yoder, would you hit the high points of Lewis's life prior to conversion that we discussed last week?
Sure. He was born in 1898 in Ireland. Major turning point of his childhood was the death of his mom, which started a downward spiral of bad boarding schools and negative influences on his life, which led him to being an atheist. Alan Jacobs says in his book that Lewis, as a young man, was probably not a very nice guy. That he had many more vices than virtues. Eventually, he went to Oxford, became a professor of literature, and met a number of interesting people, including J.R.R. Tolkien, through a long path. Returned to his Christian roots in his early 30s.
Well, last week we mostly discussed the contents of Lewis's autobiography called Surprised by Joy. That book primarily focused on events that were significant to Lewis's spiritual journey to salvation. And the contents of our conversation today will come from multiple biographies written about Lewis and interviews with Lewis, as well as his secretary, because these items are not detailed in his own autobiography. Lewis's first book published as a Christian after his conversion is called Pilgrims, Regress. It was released in 1933. Would you tell us a little bit about that book?
So what Lewis is trying to do is to tell his own story, or at least a version of his own story, using fiction and using the great classic Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan, which is a great favorite of British school children and really people around the world for hundreds of years. And so he tries to tell the story. The protagonist is a man named John, and he's on a quest for the celestial city. It's a journey, and along the way he meets people like Mr. Enlightenment and Mother Kirk and Mr. Broad and a number of others that are pretty obvious characters, and he interacts with the ideas and the challenges of the day in his pursuit of the celestial city. It's supposed to, in some ways, be a version of Lewis's own spiritual journey. I don't think it has some of the same sense of wonder and literary grace that characterizes most of Lewis's work. It's not my favorite of his works. In fact, Lewis himself recognized that. He came back to it some years later and tried to patch a few mistakes and apologize for some heavy-handedness at a few places. Lewis is finding his way as a writer.
And as a Christian writer, Christian book, right?
That's right. He has not yet become a prominent person in academia in terms of his writing.
Yeah, so he's not well known at all when he writes Pilgrim's Regress.
No. He had tried to write some poetry that wasn't wildly received. He's also going to try his hand at some literary criticism. That's going to be a lot better received, but he's not a famous individual in the early part of the 1930s. But it won't be long.
Yes, right. And in 1933, Lewis also joined a group of men who began meeting. They called themselves the Inklings. Tell us more about this group, what their name meant, and their purpose for gathering together.
Well, they didn't plan to start a club or a group or anything like that. It was just some people that liked to get together. Lewis says at one point he wrote a little blurb for one of his publishers. This was later in his life, and he said, "The sound I love most of anything in the world is the male laughter." Friends were very important to him, and he loved to get together with intellectually minded individuals, men, and to talk. He loved to go for walks. They would walk. His brother was a part of this group. Some of his friends from school, Barfield and Coghlan, we met. And, of course, J.R. Tolkien, who was perhaps the most important member other than Lewis. Inklings, Tolkien said it was Lewis's idea for the term. An inkling was one who dabbles in half-formed ideas, scribbling with a pen, doodling, as it were, doodling intellectually and literarily. And so what they did a lot of times was they would just talk and enjoy each other's company, but because so many of them were writers, they would bring drafts of their work and read them, a chapter maybe, and solicit feedback. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, most people who like to write are very concerned about what other people are going to think and aren't always
protective of their writings.
Yes, and protective of their self-esteem. And so these men shared their writings. There were others, but Lewis and Tolkien are the most important. And so this was the cauldron, if you will, out of which their important literature was formed. I don't think it's an overstatement at all to say that if it wasn't for this group and Lewis's encouragement of Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit probably never would have been published. Tolkien was a notorious slow writer with some doubts and wasn't sure of himself, but Lewis encouraged him, and he said there was really something powerful and important, and eventually they emerged fully formed. Lewis probably would have still written if it wasn't for Tolkien, but his writings may not have been quality that they are if it wasn't for Tolkien's influence. You know, Tolkien had some pointed criticisms. One of the things that is famous when Lewis read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, his friends, first of all, were shocked that he was writing children's literature. Right. Here's a bachelor who didn't really like kids, but he's writing children's literature. And Tolkien in particular was not happy at all when Father Christmas made an appearance in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he says, "No, that's a mistake. You're crossing worlds. Yeah. Father Christmas belongs to our world, not to Narnia. It doesn't belong there." And Lewis didn't change his mind, and they argued about that. And they argued about a lot of things along these lines. Their relationship and the existence of the Inklings, from a literary perspective, one of the most important associations of the 20th century.
But not everyone knows, but Lewis wrote a science fiction trilogy. The first in that series was written in 1938. So we're going chronologically, some of the works that he's written. So in 1938, he writes the first of his science fiction trilogy. And time doesn't allow us to go into any kind of detail on these. But Dr. Yoder, would you give us a quick summary of these and how theology even permeates it, doesn't it?
These are really interesting. I love the space trilogy, particularly the first one called Perelandra, which is the story of a man named Ransom who was kidnapped and taken on a voyage to Mars. This is a great reflection on the problem of evil, and Lewis here describes evil as something that is bent, I believe, like Lewis does, that evil is corruption of the good. The next one is called Out of the Silent Planet. It's set on the planet Venus. Basically, it's the story of creation and the fall, using some human characters and beautiful descriptions, lots of really interesting theology. And then the last one is That Hideous Strength, has important connections to the abolition of man and some of his concerns about ethics and the role of science and scientism.
Well, in 1940, Lewis writes an apologetic book called The Problem of Pain. Now, Lewis was not a trained theologian or apologist per se, but nevertheless was not intimidated to write outside this field, which I might add there's evidence that this led to some of his colleagues looking down upon him for writing outside of his discipline. Lewis became known as the apostle to the skeptics. Would you discuss how this untrained theologian became so influential?
Yeah, it's really an interesting story. I think the first thing that we have to remember is that Lewis is a real intellectual. He is one of the most well-read people of his generation, maybe of any generation. Voracious reader and remembers so much of what he read. Now, he did not study theology at Oxford, and he often comments on the fact that he's not a theologian and sometimes uses that as something in his defense because so many in the first half of the 20th century were pursuing more liberal or modern theological ideas. And a lot of academic theology then and still is outside of what we would typically think of as orthodoxy. Lewis, as a smart, well-read individual, grasped the basics of Christian theology fairly well. We don't really know a lot about, at least I don't know a lot about what theological theological books he read.
Right.
And occasionally we find in his writings places where he makes some basic theological mistakes. For instance, in The Problem of Pain, he talks about total depravity and how he doesn't believe in it. And I think he doesn't really understand what total depravity really is. And
He does come across as an anti-Calvinist in many points, doesn't he?
Yes, he's probably much more Arminian than Calvinist. There are definitely places in which, from a theological perspective, we would look at him and say, not quite. He doesn't cite the Bible all that much. One of the criticisms sometimes is lack of biblical references. However, because Lewis is a bona fide scholar, a real intellectual, and not somebody who is liberal or modernistic in their theological approach, Lewis's understanding of Christianity is very traditional. He believes in Trinity. He believes in historicity of the text. He believes in miracles. And he believes these kind of traditional sorts of things, the kind of traditional things that we believe here at DTS. And so he becomes a really outstanding spokesperson. I oftentimes put it this way. After the Enlightenment in the 1700s, intellectual mindset shifts quite a bit and eventually becomes the default position that educated people in Europe or in the West are secular. And we get these more radical 19th century thinkers like Nietzsche and Freud and Marx and Darwin who are poking at various aspects of the Christian worldview. Darwin pokes at the idea of a creator, and Nietzsche pokes at Christian ethics, and Marx at the notion of a Christian-based government. And poking is two kind of word, right? These are broadside slashes at these worldviews. And I don't think that anybody comes along who really challenges these ideas with solid scholarship until C.S. Lewis. Now, there are others that challenge them. I mean, we've got evangelists and missionaries and others, but someone who really, in an intellectual way, challenges these ideas until Lewis. And so it's really important that here we have an Oxford Don, a world-class scholar in literature, a man with great critical thinking skills, and a gift for writing and explaining difficult things to the masses, that he comes along and steps into that gap. And really, I think he's the beginning of the resurgence of the evangelical movement that we see in the later half of the 20th century that really has produced a rise in Christian philosophy and Christian history and Christian scholarship, broadly speaking.
Very interesting. And of course, he himself was a skeptic. So he
knows. So that's why he's able to be, quote about the apostle to the skeptics, right? He knows what it's like. He's not just guessing. Yeah. He knows. He remembers the arguments that he had. He remembers the hurdles that he had to clear. He remembers the intellectual problems that he had to face. And so he can address them head on.
You're saying in Britain at this time, it was pretty thoroughly infiltrated, the seminaries and the churches.
Yeah, it really was. The denominations, the churches, the structure, Britain, in Germany, in France, they were heavily dominated by liberal thinking. And so Lewis stands like a tree in a storm, right? He's not bowed by those things. And so he can write Problem of Pain and ultimately Mere Christianity and others that defend a very traditional Christianity with supernatural elements, miracles, heaven, hell, these realities that he embraces and defends fervently.
Dr. Yoder, would you agree Lewis's fame and influence was really jump-started by a series of radio talks he held on the British Broadcasting Channel radio program during World War II? Would you tell us about that series?
It's really a great story. During the war, the BBC felt like that their duty was to kind of bolster the morale of the British citizens, and they were looking for someone to give talks that were more religious, more spiritual. But interestingly, they did not look for a clergyman or something like that. One of the producers had read Lewis's Problem of Pain and thought that he had just the right tone. And so there was some interviews back and forth. And eventually Lewis gave these broadcast talks, as they were called, and they were very popular. Lewis had a big booming voice. He liked to say that he sounded like a butcher. He had a big booming voice. He had developed his ability to lecture at Oxford. In his context, he had developed a style. It translated very well into radio. They were popular. He did a series of talks over a number of years during the war, and they were very popular and very encouraging. And they were very apologetic. They were making an apologetic case for God and for the Bible and for traditional morality and ultimately for Jesus Christ. They were released in little pamphlets along the way. Eventually, in the early 50s, they were collected together. Lewis found a term that he liked. He called them Mere Christianity. It is one of the great apologetic books of church history.
Certainly one of the most influential 20th century writer, wasn't he?
Absolutely. I think it was his book, The Problem of Pain. I think it was his broadcast talks. And also his publication of Screwtape Letters, which is right around the same time that made him very famous.
Screwtape was on Time magazine front
Yeah,
cover,
that's what I was
right?
going to say.
Oh,
He was on the cover of Time magazine, and most people would have assumed that he was on the cover of Time magazine because of the Narnia Chronicles. No, this was in the 40s. The Narnia Chronicles were written in the 50s. It was on the strength of his radio broadcasts and Screwtape, Problem of Pain books. That's what made him famous in Britain, in America, and worthy of a cover of Time magazine.
This is a secular radio program that's
Yes, the
choosing.
BBC.
It's been said that his voice, apart from Winston Churchill, he became the second most well-recognized voice.
I wouldn't be surprised. He had a very distinctive style, and people tuned in to hear what he had to say. It was definitely apologetics. He was defending the faith. He was engaged in what I call negative and positive apologetics. Negative apologetics is to refute the objections, and positive apologetics is to make the case for what you believe. And so he was refuting naturalism and materialism and helping to provide positive reasons for belief in God, for reasons to trust the Bible and to affirm Christ as our Savior.
And in 2 weeks, we'll discuss Mere Christianity, which again is the outflow of these talks.
Yep.
In just a moment, we're going to continue the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. But first, our missions moment of the week. Today's testimonial is from a student at the National Theological College and Graduate School.
My name is Wellington. When NTCGS came to Uganda, I was student number 1. And I remember sitting under Dr. Paul's teaching, and one of the things that he taught us that I cannot forget is this idea of literal hermeneutics. I think this was a very important subject that I needed to learn very early, to know how to actually exegete the Word of God. The teaching is very practical. I'm literally taking this information and bringing it to pastors as it is. So these are the raw facts right now. From the time that I started applying or using NTCGS material to teach pastors, I have replanted about 27 churches. I have planted 2 churches. And the journey continues. Right now, there are opportunities that God has laid for me and my team to move beyond even Uganda using the same materials. It's about 2 Timothy 2:2. I'm so excited to see what the Lord has in store going forward. Thank you very much.
The National Theological College and Graduate School is a strategically placed school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. To learn more about how you can partner with NTCGS in equipping future leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ in Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Now, let's return to our conversation. Well, due to the notoriety of J.R.R. Tolkien, the close friendship Lewis had with Tolkien has generated a great deal of interest. Would you discuss that?
Sure. Lewis and Tolkien, it's a great friendship, a very important. They were good friends for many years. Their friendship, had its ups and downs and drift apart and then come back together and so on. But Lewis was very much impacted by Tolkien's Christian faith. I'm not sure Lewis would have become a Christian in a human sense if it wasn't for Tolkien. I believe in the grace of God and the sovereignty of God. But from a human perspective, the impact of Tolkien was essential for Lewis coming to faith. And I think that Lewis's encouragement was essential for Tolkien to produce The Lord of the Rings. They both loved story. They loved what they called a fairy tale, a fairy story. Tolkien was deep at work in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings for many, many years. And Lewis, his imaginary fiction, well, it took a number of forms, right? There was the space trilogy we talked about, the science fiction. Then there was Screwtape, which is imaginative in a whole different sense. And then, as an old man, really, he began to write the Narnia Chronicles, a kind of more traditional children's stories, which I think are gems. They are beautiful, pristine stories that are lovely as stories, but they convey the spiritual and theological truths that make them so powerful.
And those books really led to this relationship that's also very controversial, right? As we think about Joy Davidman. So there had been a great deal of interest in Lewis's love life, isn't there? Lewis was a bachelor along with his brother Warney for many years, but it wasn't until his 60s that he gets married to Joy Davidman. Tell us a little bit about that. And it's her sons that get interested in the book series of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
So probably he was in his 50s. She was an American, an interesting person. She was a divorcee. She had some connections with communism.
She was Jewish, right?
Yeah. And so polar opposite of Lewis in many regards, especially at this stage of his life. She, like many others, had read Lewis's books and wrote letters. Lewis was besieged by letters, and he did his best to try to answer them. And this is one of the great sources that we have for Lewis. I'm sure there are people all over the world, families that have C.S. Lewis letters that he wrote to somebody that they're holding on to. There have been many, many letters published, but she was one of those that wrote letters. It was a bad marriage. She had 2 sons. She left to come to England to try to get away from him. She met Lewis a couple of times and his brother. Socially, she had questions, and he was helping her. But eventually, their friendship became more than that. She was going to be deported. Her visa was up. And so Lewis agreed to get married in order to allow her to stay in England. They were married in a civil ceremony. Then she got sick. Relationship was not just a formal one, but it became real marriage. And they were married in the church. Her cancer went into remission. Then it came back again, and she passed away. They were, I think, married about 4 years. It's both a great love story and a tragedy. Lewis's friends, including his brother, were very, very puzzled by this. You know, again, Lewis was the one that said the thing he loved most of all was adult male laughter. He was a confirmed bachelor. He didn't like children. And now he takes up with a woman with 2 little boys. They were very puzzled and concerned. She was a very sharp thinker and a writer. There's a great irony, right? Lewis wrote this autobiography called Surprised by Joy, and he's talking about this idea of joy, but the woman that he marries named it. There's certainly a kind of delicious irony in the fact that surprised by joy means a whole different thing, you know, in terms of him being surprised by getting married.
Yeah. They have this legal marriage just so that she can stay in Britain.
UK.
And it's not, there's no sexual relations at this point, as far as we can tell. It's just purely to get a visa. And Tolkien didn't like that very well, did he?
No, and I don't think that Warney did as well. I think it wasn't just an act of charity. I think there was something there, a friendship that was deeper, but it wasn't a full-fledged romance.
They
clearly.
wouldn't live together.
No, they didn't live together. But part of her, part of getting sick, that all those things, all those complicating factors wove together to create a real marriage. And they genuinely loved each other and they committed to each other. She came to live at the Kilns, which was the name of their home, where Lewis and Warney and Mrs. Moore had lived for a long time. Of course, she was off the scene by now. So Joy and Jack and Warney lived at the Kilns until really all of them died. Yeah.
There's a book about this, too, called Becoming Mrs. Lewis.
I don't think there's any doubt that they were truly in love. The story of them coming together is rather unusual. They had a deep and significant relationship, which tragically was cut short. One of Lewis' most moving books is his book, A Grief Observed, which is raw lament in his grieving the loss of his wife. It's an exceptional book, very different from his others. You compare the problem of pain and the grief observed, and you see 2 very different parts of the wrestling with the problem of evil. And,
one's intellectual, right?
Yes.
Problem of
and the other
pain.
is very emotional, dealing with all of his thought. Is God sadistic? Does God enjoy pain? Is God just doing this for his own joy? And he doesn't really believe that, but he's wrestling with Lewis's book. I think is a really helpful one for the grieving process of leading us to lament properly.
Several documentaries, I think, are helpful, but there's Hollywood version, the Shadowlands, right?
Yes.
It's hard to look at Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, also as C.S. Lewis. So,
well, he's a good actor. I think he does a nice job portraying Lewis. Deborah Winger portrays Joy. It's a well-made movie. I wouldn't take it as the actual gospel truth in terms of their relationships. It's well done.
They did consult Doug Gresham, I believe, on that, which is the stepson that Lewis took care of even after Joy died. But she had 2 sons, and there's only one in the movie. So there is certainly some details that they didn't focus on.
Exactly.
The other one had some mental challenges.
Doug was the one that continued in a relationship with Lewis and went through some of his struggles, but became a Christian and wrote a book called The Lenten Land, which was the story of his life. It's really interesting.
There are also some interesting interviews with Douglas Gresham, and interesting to see that relationship of Lewis in his older years where he's about to die. And
very poignant.
Doug Gresham. The death of C.S. Lewis occurred in 1963, but it did not get the attention that one would expect. Would you explain why that's the case?
Lewis died the same day that JFK was assassinated. And in fact, also the day that Aldous Huxley died, who was also a famous intellectual. And there's a Catholic philosopher by the name of Peter Kreeft, who's a big fan of Lewis, has written some more creative works of philosophy. And one of his books imagines JFK and C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley arriving at the gates of St. Peter at the same time to give their account of what they think. And of course, they're all very different. It's an interesting trichotomy there of positions and beliefs. It's an exploration of worldview. But yeah, Lewis died the same day that Kennedy was assassinated. And of course, that was worldwide news.
Would you speak for a moment about Walter Hooper, how he's been so influential?
Walter Hooper plays an important role. He was a grad student who got an opportunity to come to the UK. He became his secretary for Lewis, who had a mountain of paperwork, letters and correspondence and other sorts of things. And his health was failing so Hooper came and lived and worked with them. When Lewis died, he became the caretaker of all of his papers. And Hooper turned this into a career of publishing Lewis's books, some 30 books of essays, articles, sermons.
Letters to children.
Poems. Hooper was very instrumental in helping to publish some of these things that either were unpublished or had been published in obscure little journals and papers and periodicals, and making them available. I can't tell you how many books I have in my library that are Walter Hooper edited because it made them available. God of the Dock, and a number of others that are really important. He also wrote a number of large kind of reference works, summaries, lists of characters, terms and ideas and other sorts of things, a C.S. Lewis companion that are very helpful.
I also, in an interview with him, heard him say that not only would he bring a new book to be published, Lewis's writings, but he would then say, I'll let you publish this, but you need to republish or provide a new edition of previous books that have been out of print. So he's also ensuring that certain books that are no longer in print get back into print.
Yeah.
Dr. Yoder, as we wrap up this podcast, what is it about the writings of C.S. Lewis that continue to impact a new generation of readers?
It's a really good question. It deserves a little reflection. I think that what we see in C.S. Lewis is this really successful marriage of the creative with the intellectual. Lewis is a first-class scholar, a genuine intellectual, a man with great intellectual and critical thinking gifts, but also a man who is creative. Alan Jacobs says that what unites all of Lewis's work is his love of wonder, to become enchanted, and a recognition that this enchantment is really necessary. We live in a world in which people are disillusioned, in which people are secular and materialistically minded, and because of that, they lose the sense of the wonder of the world, the sparkle, the glory, the majesty, which is really a pointer to God. And Lewis retrieves that, and his books are infused with that. So they're a real antidote to the world weariness that we experienced in the 21st century.
And he's written over so many different genres that if you like sci-fi, there's something there for you.
Exactly.
If you like story and
children's story,
stories,
imaginative
theology,
literature,
apologetics.
Popular level apologetics, academic, literary criticism, it's all there. It's all there.
And we encourage our listeners to take notice and be influenced by the writings of C.S. Lewis. He may be the most commonly quoted, apart from maybe Charles Spurgeon, in our churches and amongst pastors because his thoughts are so concise and clear.
I think so.
Well, there's much, much more that could be said about the life of C.S. Lewis, but that will have to suffice for now, because our time's up for today's podcast, but I do hope that you will join us again next week as Dr. Yoder will return to the podcast and we discuss a very interesting and I dare say prophetic book at the time it was written by Lewis. Some of what we see happening in our culture today was warned by Lewis in a book called The Abolition of Man. So join us next week for that discussion. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.